Hi, Modern World History students. We're still in Unit 8, which is the Second World War, and now the United States is in the war because the Japanese Navy and its aircraft have bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. That brings the United States into the war, and that marks a major transition point in the war because the United States had remained neutral for the first 2 years, really, of the war. And now the United States was in on the side of the Allied powers. So this is a really good, important time um, to sort of do a game reset, I guess we'll call it. Remind ourselves of who's fighting in this war, who's on whose side, where's the fighting going on. So that's what we'll do, and we'll also talk about how the strategy of the Allied powers changed once the United States joined the war. So let's start with our sort of game reset here. So I'm on page 15, and I'm going to start us off in that area where Japan and the United States and our allies were fighting after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, unlike World War I, where basically all of the major fighting took place in Europe, in World War II, there's major fighting taking place really on both sides of the world. And so, in addition to fronts, when we talk about World War II, we're talking about what are called theaters of operations, or simply just theaters. Okay? So, there is a European theater of operations in World War II, sometimes simply called the ETO, and there is a Pacific theater of operations, sometimes called the PTO. You think about a theater, it's a place where action happens. You go to the theater, and down on the stage, there's a play going on, there's a performance going on. And so think of World War II the same way. There are two different places in the world where there's action taking place. There's action taking place in Europe, so we call that the European theater. There's action taking place in the Pacific, so we call that the Pacific theater. And I'm not going to break up the Pacific theater into fronts. If we were doing a more detailed class on World War II, we might, but I'm not going to do that. I'm simply going to talk about the theater in general. So tell me, who is fighting for the Axis powers? Now, we talked about the Rome-Berlin Axis, which was an alliance between Germany and Italy. So we would say, well, is it Germany or Italy who's fighting for the Axis powers in the Pacific theater? And of course, the answer is no. They're not fighting in the Pacific theater. So who is? What country joined Germany and Italy to form the Axis powers? And the answer is Japan, right? So in the end, the Axis powers consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And in the Pacific theater, it's Japan that's doing the fighting. On the side of the Allied powers, who's doing the fighting for the Allies? Well, given the attack on Pearl Harbor, we say the United States. So the United States is doing the fighting in the Pacific theater for the Allied powers. But also, if you remember, on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Japanese naval forces attacked not only Pearl Harbor, but all of the American possessions in the Pacific, and also all of the British possessions in the Pacific. So the British, the United Kingdom, will also be fighting on the side of the Allied powers against Japan in the Pacific theater. And remember, there is a country that Japan had been at war with for 4 years, going all the way back to 1937 by the time Pearl Harbor was attacked. Who's that? What country had Japan invaded going all the way back to 1937? That's China. So China will also be on the side of the Allied powers in the Pacific theater. So in the Pacific Theater of Operations, the PTO, which I encourage you to kind of circle or make a big rectangle around that on your map, you've got Japan fighting for the Axis powers. You've got the United States, Britain, or the United Kingdom, and China fighting for the Allied powers. Now, if we shift over to the European Theater of Operations, the ETO, this we're going to divide into fronts because you're a little more familiar with that. We had fronts in World War I. So the European theater will divide into fronts also. And you'll notice that the European theater is sort of expansive here. If we look at the red rectangle that I've drawn down there on the map, you'll see that the European theater of operations actually extends into North Africa as well. So it's not purely European, and it extends into parts of Asia on the eastern side of the theater. So it's not just a European theater. There's action going on in North Africa and the western parts of Asia as well. And we're going to divide the European theater up into three fronts. So let's start with the Western Front. And you see the Western Front located here on the map. You can see that the Western Front extends along the borders between Germany and France and Belgium, all the way up into what's called the North Sea and up into Norway, because remember the Germans invaded Norway. So who was fighting for the Axis powers on the Western Front of the European theater? Who was fighting for the Axis powers on the Western Front? Well, that'll be Germany, right? Germany invaded Belgium and France. Germany invaded Norway. So it's Germany that's fighting for the Axis powers on the Western Front. On the side of the Allied powers, who are they fighting against? Well, at the beginning, yes, France, right? But of course, France was defeated very, very quickly. And so who then took up the fight on the Western Front? First, it would be who? It would be the British, right? The United Kingdom. And then later on, once the United States joined the war, then the United States would also be fighting against Germany on the Western Front, and Canada as well, by the way. So if we're looking at the Western Front, the Axis powers are represented by Germany. The Allied powers are represented by France, briefly, until they're defeated. Then the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, primarily. All right, well, let's shift to the other side of the European theater of operations. Go over to the Eastern Front. So who is going to represent the Axis powers on the Eastern Front? Well, it's going to be Germany again. So Germany, just like in World War I, finds themselves fighting a two-front war in World War II, largely due to really bad, dumb decisions made by Adolf Hitler. So it's Germany representing the Axis powers on the Eastern Front. Who are they fighting against on the Eastern Front? Who represents the Allied powers on the Eastern Front? Well, it really is only one country. Realistically, just one country. And that is who? It's going to be the Soviet Union, the USSR. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. And so Germany and the Soviet Union will be fighting it out on the Eastern Front of the European theater. And finally, we move south to the Mediterranean Front. So the Mediterranean Front is the area that is sort of defined by the Mediterranean Sea and the coastlines of the Mediterranean Sea, Southern Europe, North Africa primarily. So here is the Mediterranean Sea. Here is the southern coastline of Europe. Here is the northern coastline of Africa. So that's that whole area surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. Who will be fighting for the Axis powers on the Mediterranean Sea, or in the Mediterranean Front? Well, it's going to start out being the one member of the Axis we haven't really assigned a battle area yet, right? Japan had the Pacific Theater. Germany has the Western and Eastern fronts of Europe. So now on the Mediterranean Front, it's going to be Italy. However, just like in World War I, where Germany found that their allies were quite weak and they had to sort of take over the war efforts for their weaker allies, Germany will be faced by the same problem in World War II. Italy's going to run into problems. They're not going to be successful. A lot of Italians weren't very enthusiastic about fighting this war. And as a result, Germany is going to have to take over Italy's war effort. In North Africa, and then even when the Allied powers invaded Italy, it was not the Italians who defended Italy against that invasion, but rather German forces took over Italy and fought against the Allied powers. So in the end, it starts out with Italy, but then Germany joins Italy and they fight on the Mediterranean front as well. So in Germany's case, it's like World War I all over again, where they found themselves effectively fighting on all three fronts of the European theater. As for the Allied powers on the Mediterranean front, it's going to be mostly the United States and the British. United Kingdom and the United States fighting for the Allied powers on the Mediterranean front. So that kind of just helps you to kind of reset where we are, who's fighting on whose side, where's the fighting going on, who's fighting against whom. That's really what the purpose of this was. The other issue, though, now that the United States is in the war, is how does that change the Allied strategy for fighting the war? How does the entry of the United States impact the strategy of the Allied powers? So that'll be the other part of this Ed puzzle. So let's go over to page 16 and start at the top here. So Allied strategy. There are areas of agreement amongst the Allied leaders and areas of disagreement. Let's start with areas of agreement. So one area where the Allies were in full agreement was basically how to prioritize your efforts during the war. So do you try to sort of fight Germany and Japan and Italy? We won't forget Italy. Do you sort of try to fight them all simultaneously and divide your resources and split them up into two different parts of the world, sending half of your resources to fight the Germans and Italians in Europe and half of them to fight the Japanese in the Pacific? And the conclusion of the Allied military planners and military leaders really was no, that would be a bad idea. That was the wrong approach. But that rather you should prioritize fighting one enemy over the other. And it was decided that enemy, the enemy that needed to be prioritized, was Germany. The Allied military leaders concluded that Germany was a much more immediate and dangerous threat than Japan. And there were a variety of reasons for that. One of those was just like sheer proximity. So like Germany and Germany's armies were much closer to conquering the Allied countries than Japan's were. So at the time when the United States entered the war, German forces invading the Soviet Union had pushed to within 50 miles of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. Capturing the capital of the Soviet Union probably would have knocked the Soviet Union out of the war. So the Germans were an imminent threat to take over the Soviet Union. They had already captured huge chunks of Soviet territory. They had knocked France out of the war. Germany now occupied France. And of course, they were bombing Britain. And Britain was just right across the English Channel from German-occupied Belgium and France. So the potential of a German invasion of Britain, although unlikely, continued to be out there. So Germany was the more dangerous threat because of just proximity. They were closer. Japan, meanwhile, was separated from the United States and Britain by half a world. There was no danger that Japan was going to invade Britain or the United States, or even really the Soviet Union. So that was one thing. Another thing was that Germany had a lot more resources than Japan did. Germany conquered the territory of the empire that Germany had conquered was all connected to Germany by land. It was all one big landmass that was connected together. And so all of the resources of that territory, mineral resources, coal, iron ore, petroleum, oil, for fueling tanks and trucks and planes, that was all connected to Germany by land. In Japan, that wasn't the case. Japan were these islands, and yes, they had conquered this empire, and yes, they had access to mineral resources from China and Manchuria and Indonesia and places like that, but those were all separated from Japan by hundreds of miles of ocean, which meant that in order to have access to those resources, the Japanese had to load them onto cargo ships and transport them to Japan, where they could be made into weapons of war. This would be very difficult. And of course, as we've talked about, Japan as a series of volcanic islands really didn't have a lot of those kinds of resources on their own. So it was going to be a lot easier to disrupt Japan's ability to access resources. And Germany was much farther advanced in military technology than Japan was. We've talked about how the Germans, by the end of the war, had developed the jet engine and guided missiles and things like that. They had better tanks and planes. And the Japanese really didn't have that. So, for a whole variety of reasons, it was determined that the Allies should really put their resources into beating Germany first. So it was a Germany first strategy, or if you prefer, a Europe first strategy, that the Allied military and political leaders agreed to when they first sort of started thinking about how to fight this war. Now, for the United States, this was a little bit complicated because Japan had just wiped out our Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. That left the west coast of the United States, that left California, Oregon, Washington, the state of Washington, potentially vulnerable to a Japanese invasion. So for the United States, we agreed to this strategy, but we couldn't really quite implement it and participate in it fully until we had defeated the Japanese Navy somewhere in the Pacific in order to stop the march of Japanese forces across the Pacific toward our west coast. We obviously could not put the bulk of our resources into fighting Germany if Japan was a real threat to invade California. So, in order for us to fully participate in this strategy, the United States is going to have to defeat the Japanese Navy somewhere in the Pacific and stop Japan's advance toward California. But once we do that, then we can sort of, at that point, hold the Japanese at arm's length, say, we'll deal with you later type thing, and put our resources, the bulk of them, into defeating Germany. So there's a little bit of a hitch there for us and our participation in this strategy. But even despite that, we still agreed this was the right strategy. Once we stop the Japanese, we can hold them at arm's length. We'll focus our resources on beating Germany. They're the more dangerous, more immediate threat. So that was an area where the Allies all agreed. But we didn't agree about everything. The relationship between the United States and Britain was a very cordial and very functional one during World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill got along very, very well. They actually were very distantly related to each other. Winston Churchill's mother was American and a distant relative of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But think about all the things that made it the relationship between us and the British work. We had shared values. We had similar forms of government. We spoke the same language. We had history together. The United States had grown out of British colonies. So the relationship between the United States and Britain, between Churchill and Roosevelt, was a very natural and smooth one. The relationship between the two of them and Joseph Stalin, on the other hand, was more difficult. Stalin himself, as you know, was a sort of a paranoid figure, suspicious, secretive, not one who liked sharing information. He believed that sharing information put him at a disadvantage, so he tended not to do it. And of course, didn't speak the same language as Churchill and Roosevelt, didn't have the same values, a very different form of government, a communist dictatorship, one which, didn't value the lives of its own people. So that relationship was always going to be a difficult one. But what made it particularly difficult now was that the Soviet Union was now being invaded by Germany. German forces, the Germans had assembled the largest invasion force in human history and were invading the Soviet Union. And already, in the 6 months to a year since that invasion had begun, huge chunks of Soviet territory had been taken over. The Germans had pushed to within 50 miles of Moscow, and millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had been killed, or they'd been captured by the Germans and sent to the concentration camps, death camps of the Holocaust. Because remember, Adolf Hitler was seeking to exterminate not just Jews, but Slavic people as well, whom he also regarded as subhuman. So once the United States entered the war, Joseph Stalin was determined that the Allies, the Western Allies, the United States, Britain, Canada, should, as soon as possible, like immediately, invade Western Europe. What he wanted was an immediate invasion, US, British, and Canadian forces to invade German-occupied France, right? To cross the English Channel and invade France in order to draw off German forces, in order to force the Germans to send more of their resources over to the Western Front because as Stalin perceived it, Germany was right now able to concentrate all of its armies, all of its resources on invading the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. And so what he was seeking was some relief, right? He wanted the Americans, British, and Canadians to invade France, German occupied France, to force the Germans to shift resources away from invading the Soviet Union over to the Western Front. The problem, and honestly, Franklin D. Roosevelt was pretty sympathetic to that view of things and was favorable to this idea. It was really Churchill who shot this idea down. And Churchill said, look, yes, it's true that the United States has entered the war, but the United States isn't fully geared up for war. Like, the United States was really not prepared for war. The industry of the United States had not shifted over to a wartime industry, completely. We hadn't really had time to do it. The U.S. Army was still in the process of being recruited and trained. And Churchill said, look, if we launch an invasion of German-occupied France, it'll be defeated. It will not succeed. It will fail, and it will fail miserably. And that will have very negative effect, not just on Britain and the United States and Canada, but also on the Soviet Union. So Churchill said to Stalin, you may think that you have all the German forces concentrating on invading the Soviet Union, but that's not really true. The Germans know that we will be invading France on the Western Front at some point in the future, but they don't know when and they don't know exactly where. So even though you think you have all the German army invading the Soviet Union right now, you don't actually have that. There are German forces being held on the Western Front, in Western Europe, in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in anticipation of us invading. And honestly, that's, in terms of the impact on the Soviet Union, that's just as good as us actually invading, or at least it's almost as good as us actually invading. He said, but on the other hand, if we invade now, when we're not prepared for it, and we lose, which we will, the invasion will fail, then Hitler will know that it will take us 6 months to a year to be able to gear up for a second invasion. And during that 6 months to a year, he really will be able to throw everything he's got at the Soviet Union and finish you guys off. And he said, that's actually worse. Churchill argued that's actually worse for the Soviet Union. So Churchill argued that an American, British, Canadian invasion of German-occupied Western Europe now was actually not just bad for the British and Americans and Canadians, but bad for the Soviet Union also. And so what he offered up to Stalin as a sort of a consolation prize was for the British and Americans to start their attacks in sort of North Africa and in the southern part of Europe, that is, on the Mediterranean front. Churchill said, look, on the Mediterranean front, we're dealing with a much less well-prepared and determined enemy. We're dealing with the Italians, who really aren't very committed to this war, particularly the Italian civilian population. They sort of saw this war as Germany's war, and they had gotten dragged into it unwillingly. We're dealing with the Vichy French, that is, that part of the French who are collaborating with Germany, but probably not very enthusiastic about it. And so what Churchill said is, look, we're not ready to launch an invasion here across the English Channel into German-occupied France or Belgium or the Netherlands. We're not prepared. That'll simply be defeated. And that will allow the Germans to cut everything loose against you guys, the Soviets, for 6 or 12 months, and that'll be disastrous. But we have enough stuff that we can invade North Africa, we can invade southern Italy, and we can create problems for the Axis that may also draw off additional German forces and give you some relief in that way. This is referred to as the soft underbelly of Europe. Churchill never used exactly that phrase, but others did. The idea was to think of Europe as a sort of an alligator who has two ends that are dangerous. You got the business end up front with the teeth, and he said that right now that's chomping at the Soviet Union, and then the tail is very powerful and can knock you down. And here's the tail of the alligator. The teeth are here, the body, and then the tail. And he says these are the two dangerous ends. But the soft underbelly of the alligator has no armor, right? The top of an alligator is armored and protected. The soft underbelly isn't. And he said, that's where we can make attacks right now that can actually have an impact. And so he told Stalin, no, there will be no invasion here where it's dangerous right now. It's going to take us a year or two to be prepared to do that, Churchill said. But we can attack here in North Africa and in Italy, and perhaps that will draw off some German forces and resources from their invasion of the Soviet Union. And Stalin accepted that very, very grudgingly. He wasn't happy about it, but he didn't have much choice. You can't force the Americans and British to launch an invasion that they don't want to invade when they don't want to do it. So Stalin sort of grudgingly accepted that because it was the best he could get. But he never stopped believing that Churchill intentionally held off on invading here, where Stalin really wanted, because Churchill had been sort of strong anti-communist, and Stalin always believed that Churchill wanted the Soviet Union to suffer from the German invasion as much as possible, so that after the war, the Soviet Union would come out weaker. So there was always that suspicion on the part of Joseph Stalin. And in the long run, that contributed to the growth of difficult relations, bad relations, between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, the US and Britain, after the war was over, and contributed to the beginning of what's called the Cold War. So that's as far as I want to go with that, just kind of getting you up to date on where we stand, talking about Allied strategy, areas where we agreed, areas where we disagreed, to kind of set the stage really now for the rest of the war. 1942 is going to be a turning point year in the war. It's a year that you're going to go into with the Axis appearing that they have victory within their grasp. But by the end of the year, it'll be clear that the Axis is not going to win. They're going to lose. And we'll talk about the turning point battles that made that happen in an upcoming lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves, stay healthy, stay safe. Bye-bye, Modern World History students.